The chains were cold against her skin, biting deeper with every small movement she made. Her wrists were rubbed raw, her ankles bruised and swollen, yet the stepmother smiled with delight as she ordered the villagers to fasten the last lock. The iron links clinked together with a finality that echoed louder than the drumbeats of the village ceremonies. To them it was not simply punishment, it was entertainment, a spectacle they would carry in their laughter for years to come. They gathered around her as if she were an animal trapped for their amusement, shaking their heads with mock pity, whispering cruel jokes that stung worse than the chains themselves. The girl tried not to cry in front of them, though her body ached from the roughness with which she had been dragged across the ground. She had been treated unfairly for so long that the sharpness of humiliation was familiar, but chains were something new. Shackles were not just a tool of cruelty, they were a declaration. They said she did not belong to herself anymore, that even her breath was controlled by the weight of metal forced upon her. The villagers looked upon her with sneers, some pretending sorrow but secretly enjoying the power her stepmother held over her. Her stepmother strutted proudly before the crowd, the ring of keys jingling at her waist as though they were jewels. She made a show of it, pointing at the girl and laughing. "See her now. The one who always dreamed of freedom, who thought she could defy me. Let her sit in chains. Let her see what becomes of those who forget their place." The villagers roared in laughter, the sound rising like a wave, suffocating the girl until she could hardly breathe. Some of them threw dust in her direction as though she were already a corpse. But even as she sat in the dirt, the chains biting into her skin, she felt a strange flicker within her chest. It was faint, like a dying ember in a fire pit long abandoned. It did not yet warm her, nor did it give her strength, but it reminded her she was alive. And as long as she was alive, something within her could resist, even if it was only in silence. She lowered her gaze so they would not see her eyes, so they would not know that inside her mind she was whispering promises to herself. The mockery dragged on into the evening. Children were encouraged to point at her, to learn early the lesson that she was to be feared and despised. Elders muttered that the girl was cursed, that she had brought shame upon herself and deserved the weight of chains. The feast of ridicule was louder than any festival the village had held in months. All the while, her stepmother basked in glory, her laughter echoing through the gathering, her words dripping with poison that painted the girl as weak, helpless, and defeated. But the girl knew something her stepmother did not. Chains could bind flesh, but they could not silence thought. They could press down on her arms and legs, but they could not cage the fire that began to stir in the deepest parts of her spirit. With every insult thrown at her, she stored it like kindling. With every laugh aimed at her, she gathered it like dry wood. The humiliation that was meant to break her was slowly becoming the very force that would build her. Still, the night was long and the weight of her suffering was real. Her stomach growled with hunger, her lips cracked from thirst, and the ground beneath her offered no comfort. Sleep refused to come, chased away by the jeering faces that haunted her memory. Yet beneath the exhaustion she began to feel a strange rhythm in her suffering, the beating of her heart aligning with the clinking of the chains, creating a song that only she could hear. It was low, steady, unyielding. It told her she was not finished yet. As the crowd thinned and the torches dimmed, her stepmother gave one last mocking look before retreating to the warmth of her home. "Stay there," she said with satisfaction, "and remember who holds the key." The girl did not answer. She simply sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the ground, her body still aching but her spirit whispering louder than before. Alone under the vast sky, the stars above seemed brighter than usual, as though they had seen everything and bore witness to her suffering. They glittered with a quiet defiance, reminding her that even the darkest night could not last forever. She closed her eyes, and in the stillness she felt the first stirrings of something beyond the cruelty, beyond the laughter, beyond the chains. It was not freedom yet, but it was the seed of freedom, planted deep within her, waiting for the moment it would burst through the iron that sought to contain her. The night stretched endlessly, a blanket of darkness heavier than the iron chains that bound her limbs. The ground beneath her was unforgiving, a mix of dust and stone that cut into her skin with every movement. Her body ached in ways she could not fully name, her wrists swollen where the shackles dug deep, her shoulders stiff from being dragged, her legs trembling from exhaustion. Every breath felt like a battle, and every second was a reminder of the cruelty she had endured. Yet, though her body sagged, her spirit refused to surrender. The villagers had long since retreated to their homes, their laughter still echoing in her mind, but now the silence of night pressed in on her. The air was cold, sharp against her skin, and the chains seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. She tried to shift, to ease the bite of the metal, but each attempt only deepened the bruises, reminding her of her helplessness. The pain was sharp, but sharper still was the realization that she was utterly alone. Alone in the dark, abandoned by those who should have protected her, mocked by those who should have lifted her up. Her stepmother's voice haunted her ears, the cruel laughter echoing like a curse. "Stay there and remember who holds the key." Those words replayed over and over, until they were almost louder than her heartbeat. For a moment, despair clawed at her chest, whispering that maybe this was how her story would end, chained, broken, forgotten. She bowed her head, the weight of hopelessness pressing down, and for a breath she considered surrender. But deep inside her, where despair could not fully reach, something stirred. It was faint, like the flicker of a candle fighting against the wind. A warmth, fragile yet steady, began to rise from the very place pain sought to hollow out. The longer she sat in the darkness, the more she began to feel it, not in her bruised flesh but in the core of her spirit. It whispered that this night was not the end. It urged her to endure, to breathe, to let the suffering sharpen her instead of breaking her. She lifted her gaze to the sky. The stars were bright, scattered across the heavens like witnesses who could not intervene but who refused to turn away. They seemed to shimmer with silent encouragement, reminding her of something older than chains, older than cruelty, reminding her of resilience. For a long while she simply stared at them, her breathing steadying, her heartbeat aligning with the quiet rhythm of the night. The pain did not lessen, the hunger did not fade. But her mind began to shift. She started to see the chains not as proof of weakness but as a test. The iron bit into her skin, but it also reminded her she was still here, still alive. Every bruise was a mark of survival, every ache a memory she would one day wear as armor. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the echo of her stepmother's laughter, but to the quiet murmur of her own will rising from within. Time stretched on, hours blending together. The night seemed endless, but with every passing moment she grew more certain she could outlast it. She whispered to herself in silence, no words leaving her lips, but promises formed in her heart. "You will not break me. You will not define me. I am more than your chains." At one point, a cold wind swept through the village, rattling the trees and sending dust swirling around her. Instead of shivering, she felt her body respond differently. Her back straightened, her breath deepened, and for a moment it felt as though the wind bowed to her presence rather than battered her. She could not explain it, but she knew it meant something. The stirring within her was growing stronger. As dawn crept closer, she realized that the long night had changed her. She had entered it as a girl cast out, mocked and chained. But by enduring it, by sitting in the heart of her suffering without surrender, she had awakened something her stepmother had never expected. Her body was still bruised, her wrists still bound, but her spirit burned brighter than the stars above. And though no one could see it yet, she knew the truth. The chains were no longer her prison. They were her preparation. At first she thought it was her own imagination, a trick of exhaustion and pain. The night was too quiet, too heavy, and her mind had wandered into strange places before. But then it came again, soft and steady, threading its way through the silence like a secret meant only for her ears. A whisper. It seemed to rise from the chains themselves, the iron vibrating faintly against her skin as if carrying voices older than time. The sound was not loud, nor was it clear, yet it cut deeper than any blade. The whispers carried weight, the kind of weight that pressed into her bones and demanded she listen. She closed her eyes, straining to catch the words. They came in fragments, like echoes from another world. Endure, awaken, power. Each syllable seemed to hum within the metal, as though the chains themselves were alive, speaking not to her ears but to her spirit. Fear tugged at her first. She wondered if suffering had finally broken her mind, if she was hearing illusions born of pain. But the more she listened, the less it felt like madness. The whispers were too steady, too deliberate. They were not taunting like her stepmother's laughter, nor cruel like the villagers' scorn. These voices were different, measured, commanding, and strangely familiar. They felt like echoes of something she had always known but forgotten, truths buried deep within her bloodline. Her wrists throbbed where the shackles dug into her skin, yet the whispers turned the pain into something else. The sting became rhythm, each pulse a beat to accompany the murmurs of iron. It was as if the chains that were meant to silence her had instead become messengers, carrying the voices of those who had once been bound before her. Ancestors who had endured cruelty, spirits who had suffered and risen, hidden forces that had always been waiting for someone strong enough to hear. The whispers grew bolder the longer she listened. She could not translate every word, but she felt their meaning burn through her like fire. The chains do not hold you. They hold her. The one who binds will be bound. The weight you carry will return to the hands that placed it. The truth struck her like lightning, leaving her breathless. The chains were no longer symbols of her weakness. They were instruments of justice, waiting to turn against her oppressor. She lowered her head and pressed her cheek against the cold metal, not in defeat but in reverence. The iron was no longer her enemy. It was alive with the suffering of generations, humming with a promise that her pain was not wasted. For the first time since she had been locked away, she felt something other than despair. She felt chosen. The whispers quieted then, fading back into silence, but their presence lingered in her bones. The chains still dug into her skin, but they no longer felt like shackles. They felt like allies. With every breath, she could sense their weight shifting, not against her but with her, waiting for the moment to strike. And in the deep of that long night, she smiled through her exhaustion. The iron that mocked her suffering had given her its secret. Soon it would no longer be her burden. Soon it would become her weapon. The night had grown colder, but she no longer felt its bite. The whispers of the iron had settled deep into her bones, and with every breath, she could feel the latent energy coiling within her like a living flame. She raised her head, her eyes catching the faint glint of moonlight on the chains that had once been her torment. For the first time, they seemed less like instruments of punishment and more like extensions of her own will. At first it was subtle. A shiver ran through the links around her wrists, a tremor she barely noticed. Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from anticipation. She lifted her hands, testing the connection. The chains, cold and rigid for so long, responded. A link shifted ever so slightly, bending toward her touch without breaking, as if acknowledging her command. Her heart pounded, not in panic but in exhilaration. She experimented carefully. A small tug and the chains moved with her. They obeyed not because they were free, but because she had claimed authority over them. The shackles that had once crushed her flesh and spirit were now instruments of her power, extensions of the resolve she had nurtured in secret through nights of pain, hunger, and whispers. Every link seemed to hum in quiet recognition, each one vibrating with the energy of her ancestors, the spirits that had guided her, and the very essence of her own determination. Her breath came in measured rhythm as she tested the limits. The chains wrapped around her wrists, her ankles, her torso, yet they moved in fluid harmony with her motions. She could feel their weight, yes, but it was no longer a burden. Instead, it was a current of energy she could command. Her mind sharpened as her spirit strengthened, and with every passing moment, the boundaries between her will and the iron blurred. She was no longer restrained, she was in control. The air around her seemed to respond too. A flicker of movement, a subtle vibration in the ground, as if the very elements recognized the shift. She experimented further, pulling one arm slightly, and the chains followed, slithering like living creatures. The shackles twisted, coiling and uncoiling at her silent command. She marveled at the sensation. The iron had been her jailer, and now it had become her ally. Every link, every curve of metal, responded to her thoughts before she even moved. The sense of empowerment was intoxicating. Memories of mockery, starvation, and isolation surged through her, but they no longer weighed her down, they fueled her. Every insult hurled by her stepmother, every sneer of the villagers, every night spent in darkness became a pulse in her veins, amplifying the force she now wielded. Her body, once weak from suffering, felt alive with energy. Her bruises ached, yes, but they were reminders of endurance, not limitations. Then she raised her eyes toward the village. In the moonlight, the huts and pathways seemed fragile, mere constructs compared to the force she now commanded. The chains wrapped around her body like a second skin, obedient and vigilant. A simple thought, and a link lifted from the ground. Another thought, and they coiled upward, forming a protective, shifting lattice around her. The chains were not just tools, they were manifestations of her spirit made tangible. The realization came in a rush. She had been strengthened, tempered by suffering, guided by whispers, and now she could bend the very instruments of her oppression to her will. The chains that were once symbols of her powerlessness had become conduits for her dominance. She could move them, shape them, and, if needed, strike with them. The balance had shifted. She was no longer the girl who had been locked and mocked. She was the force that would break the boundaries imposed upon her. A faint wind stirred through the cellar, and she felt it acknowledge her presence, as if the entire night conspired to witness her awakening. Her eyes glimmered with determination and quiet fury, and her hands flexed as the chains twisted like serpents at her command. The first cracks of true power had formed, and there would be no turning back. She was no longer bound. She was a master. And as the night deepened, the chains hummed in silent agreement, a testament to her triumph over cruelty, a promise of reckoning for those who had ever sought to break her. The world beyond the cellar would soon feel the tremor of her rise, though they did not yet know the magnitude of what had been awakened within her. The stepmother's laughter echoed through the hall, rich and triumphant, as if it could smother every corner of the village in her pride. The long tables were laden with roasted meats, steaming bowls of grain, and ornate cups brimming with wine and palm brews. Torches flickered along the walls, casting warm golden light that danced over the assembled clan, highlighting their merriment. They clinked their goblets, sang songs of conquest and lineage, and pointed fingers at the empty corner where the girl had been locked away. Each cheer and mocking chant was a testament to their arrogance, a performance meant to remind everyone of the girl's supposed weakness. The girl watched from her hidden vantage, unseen but fully aware. The air of celebration should have felt alien, suffocating, and yet it energized her. Every laugh that rose against her name, every whispered insult, and every boasting gesture of her stepmother became fuel for the storm that was building quietly within her. She could almost taste the irony. The more they celebrated, the more blind they became to the shifts already occurring beneath the surface. Their power they believed was absolute. But power, she knew now, was fluid, and she was learning to bend it quietly, patiently, with patience earned in chains and solitude. The stepmother strutted through the room like a queen without rival, drawing the attention of every guest. Her voice rang out above the clamor, recounting tales of the girl's weakness, exaggerating every misstep, every act of failure. Villagers laughed at each tale, and children giggled nervously, uncertain but eager to please the adults. The display of arrogance was almost theatrical, as though the stepmother wished to engrave her authority into the memory of every soul present. She was so focused on triumph that she failed to notice the tremor of air in the hall, the subtle shift in atmosphere that whispered of change. The girl, unseen and unheard, felt the hum of the chains still around her wrists. They had become more than metal, they were conduits of power, sensitive to her thoughts and resolve. With a gentle flex, she felt the iron vibrate in recognition of the presence of those who had mocked her. The chains were alive with anticipation, responding to the intent she had been cultivating, bending invisibly with her silent will. Every cheer, every drumbeat, every laugh was absorbed and redirected, magnified into potential energy she could wield when the moment came. As the feast continued, the stepmother moved closer to the central table, eager to display her dominance. She waved her arms, telling stories of her cunning, her control, and her supposed wisdom in keeping the girl confined. The villagers nodded in agreement, their heads bobbing like obedient birds, blind to the subtle signals of power accumulating elsewhere. The girl's heart, once heavy with pain, now beat with anticipation and clarity. She could see the cracks forming in the veneer of her stepmother's control. Her arrogance, so blatant and untempered, had left her vulnerable. The lights from the torches cast shadows along the walls, and in those shadows, the girl began to feel the stirrings of her own energy coalesce. She breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of the room, the laughter, the music, the boasting, and converted it into focus. The stepmother believed herself untouchable, but the girl now understood the rules had changed. Every mockery, every act of cruelty, every spoonful of disdain poured into her spirit had been stored like kindling, waiting for the spark that would ignite it. By the time the main toast came, the stepmother raised her cup high, calling upon the ancestors to bless her triumph and further mock the girl's absence. The villagers cheered, unaware that their very celebration was weaving the threads of their own reckoning. The girl's gaze hardened, her mind mapping the moment, the timing, the precision of the actions to come. Her stepmother's victory, flaunted with pomp and arrogance, had become the very stage upon which the girl would reclaim her power. The room, alive with joy and self-congratulation, was deaf to the subtle shift in energy. The air itself seemed to bend imperceptibly toward the girl's presence, though none could see her. The chains hummed softly around her wrists, a quiet symphony of obedience, waiting for her command. She felt them respond to her thoughts, aligning with her intent. Every cheer from the stepmother, every jest from the villagers, became fuel, a hidden current beneath the surface of the feast that no one suspected. Even as the stepmother moved among her guests, proudly recounting tales of the girl's helplessness, she remained oblivious to the quiet storm building in the shadows. The girl's eyes, though unseen, traced each movement, calculating each step, absorbing every detail. The arrogance that filled the hall was a mask for vulnerability, and soon, it would crumble. By the end of the night, the feast had achieved exactly what it was meant to do, show the girl's supposed inferiority, but unbeknownst to anyone, it had also solidified the foundations of her rise. Every act of mockery, every chant of her failure, every morsel of arrogance consumed by her stepmother and the villagers had been converted into power. The chains, the whispers, and the long nights of suffering had all led to this moment. The girl remained unseen, but her silent triumph had already begun, preparing to overturn the false sense of dominance her stepmother and the clan so blindly celebrated. The seeds of retribution had been planted, nurtured by the very arrogance they flaunted. By the time the first embers of dawn approached, the unseen master of the chains would be ready, and the feast of triumph would become the stage of reckoning. The night was thick with silence, yet it was alive with anticipation. While the village slept under the glow of the moon and the lingering warmth of torches long extinguished, she stirred. The chains that had bound her, once cold and unyielding, now felt like extensions of her own body, pliant, obedient, and attuned to her will. Each link responded to the subtle movements of her mind, unfastening themselves without sound, slipping free as though acknowledging that their role as captors had ended. She rose slowly, letting her body stretch and flex, feeling the aches of confinement dissolve into a growing sense of purpose. The air around her seemed to thrum with potential, responding to the invisible currents of power she now commanded. Her eyes, once downcast in submission and pain, now gleamed with clarity and command, reflecting a mind that had grown sharper in the crucible of suffering. Every shadow in the cellar seemed to bow to her presence, every whisper of wind carrying the echo of her ancestors' guidance. The moment was surreal. She took her first step, and the chains, though no longer restraining her, moved in harmony with her movements. They coiled lightly around her wrists, sliding like liquid metal, a tangible manifestation of the energy that had long lain dormant within her. She breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of the night, the quiet power that had grown through years of torment, starvation, and mockery. It was not just strength she had gained, it was mastery over every element that had sought to keep her down. The village above slept unaware, their lights flickering softly in the distance. She could sense their dreams, their complacency, their belief that the girl they had tormented would never rise. Each step she took toward freedom was a quiet declaration. She was no longer the victim of their cruelty. The chains that had been tools of humiliation had become instruments of her authority, bending and flexing as her thoughts commanded. With each movement, the oppressive weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the steady rhythm of power and motion. Her hands brushed over the cold iron that had once bitten into her skin, now transformed into conduits of her own will. The chains were responsive, almost sentient, following her silent commands with a grace that belied their former rigidity. She could feel the energy within them, pulsing with her heartbeat, merging with her own force. The cellar, which had once been a tomb of despair, had become a sanctuary of awakening, a proving ground where the powerless girl had become something unstoppable. The shadows themselves seemed to bend around her, stretching and folding with her movement. Each step toward the door was deliberate, precise, a choreography of subtle power. The air vibrated softly, carrying the echoes of her ancestors' voices, guiding her with patience and clarity. She was moving not with haste, but with the calculated authority of someone who understood the weight of every action. As she approached the threshold of the cellar, the night outside seemed to recognize her ascent. The moonlight pooled at the doorway, illuminating the space with a spectral glow that highlighted her transformation. She stepped into that light, feeling the cool air against her skin, the night wind carrying whispers of triumph and warning. Though unseen by most, she moved with a presence that commanded attention, as if the world itself acknowledged the shift in power. Her eyes scanned the village beyond the cellar, tracing the paths and homes of those who had laughed at her, those who had locked her in chains, and those who had believed her broken. The energy that had lain dormant within her now surged outward, subtle but undeniable, a quiet pressure that hinted at the reckoning to come. She was no longer merely a girl bound by iron. She was a force shaped by suffering, disciplined by whispers, and guided by the knowledge that every injustice would be answered. Each step she took was measured, the chains now flowing extensions of her intent, bending and moving in silent obedience. They had become symbols not of restraint but of transformation, evidence that the girl who had been mocked and confined had turned her suffering into mastery. Her posture was straight, her head held high, and her eyes shone with the intensity of someone who had claimed dominion over both self and circumstance. The stillness of the night amplified her presence, though no one yet perceived it. Every breath she drew carried the weight of her journey, the hunger, the pain, the silent endurance, and the whispers of power that had guided her. Her very being radiated authority, unseen yet palpable, a force that would soon ripple through the village with consequences no one could ignore. With the chains now silent servants of her will, she moved through the shadows, stepping toward the world that had once rejected her. Each movement was deliberate, each step a proclamation. She had risen, unbroken and unbound. The night itself seemed to bend in respect, the darkness no longer oppressive but protective, harboring her ascent until the dawn would witness her return. And as she vanished into the quiet streets of the sleeping village, the chains that had once imprisoned her were nothing more than threads in her hands, tools of a power that no one could yet comprehend, a promise that the reckoning would soon begin. The stepmother, still wrapped in the glow of her perceived victory, had no inkling of the storm that was about to descend. She had strutted through the village, relishing the chains that had once bound the girl, mocking each sound they made, each groan of discomfort. She had believed that the girl's spirit was crushed, her power extinguished, and that the humiliation of the chains had sealed her dominion forever. But the night had been deceptive, and the chains had listened, learning, waiting for their true master to awaken. It began subtly. A faint hum vibrated through the ground, barely perceptible at first, like the whisper of distant thunder. The stepmother paused mid-step, her eyes narrowing in suspicion, sensing that something was amiss. The villagers around her, unaware, continued their feasting and merriment, oblivious to the shift in the air. Then, as if responding to an unseen command, the chains, the very same that had tormented the girl, stirred. Iron links lifted, not with weight, but with will, twisting and turning in the moonlight, moving with a precision that only the girl could command. From her hidden vantage the girl watched. Her eyes glimmered with authority, her hands raised in a subtle motion, and the chains obeyed. They slithered through the air like serpents, coiling and stretching with deliberate grace. Each link moved as if possessed, searching for the one whose cruelty had caused so much suffering. The stepmother's laughter, once ringing with arrogance, faltered as she felt the first touch of the cold metal brush against her ankle. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and the room seemed to shrink as the chains rose higher, wrapping around her legs and twisting upward with relentless determination. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by panic and fear. The villagers froze, their laughter faltering as they realized the chains were no longer mere instruments of punishment, they were agents of retribution. The stepmother's arms flailed, trying to tear them away, but they clung with a tenacity that mocked her former dominion. Every link tightened with each attempt at resistance, and every twist of the chain seemed guided by an invisible hand, precise and merciless. The girl's presence, though unseen, was palpable. She had transformed from the captive into the orchestrator of justice, the unseen force that now held the stepmother in its grip. The air thickened around the hall, charged with power and anticipation. Shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, and a low hum resonated through the room, echoing the heartbeat of the girl's vengeance. Every step the stepmother took was met with resistance from the chains, every breath she drew trembled with the weight of her impending downfall. The villagers, once so confident in their control and superiority, now watched in horror. Their eyes darted between the girl's hidden position and the stepmother struggling futilely against the rising metal. The pride that had filled the hall only moments ago was replaced with fear and confusion. No one dared approach, no one dared intervene, for the invisible force that commanded the chains was evident to all who dared look. The stepmother, the source of so much cruelty, was powerless, trapped by the very instruments she had used to dominate another. With each passing second, the chains tightened, coiling higher, moving from her ankles to her waist, and then upward toward her shoulders and arms. The stepmother's frantic movements became frantic, desperate, and yet entirely futile. Her screams echoed through the hall, sharp and jagged, a sound the girl had once heard directed at herself. Now those cries belonged to the stepmother, and each one reverberated like a lesson etched into the minds of all present. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The girl, still unseen, directed each movement with calm precision. She did not act in anger but with controlled authority, the culmination of years of suffering, patience, and hidden strength. Each twist and coil of the chains was measured, ensuring the stepmother could not escape yet never causing permanent harm. Justice, not cruelty, guided her actions. The air seemed to pulse with energy, a rhythm that echoed the girl's heartbeat, synchronizing the chain's motion with her will. Finally, the stepmother was fully bound, standing rigid in the center of the hall, the chains cradling her like a cold, unyielding embrace. She trembled, her face pale, her laughter extinguished, replaced by the raw realization of her own vulnerability. The villagers dared not move, frozen by the spectacle, understanding that the girl, once broken, had become something beyond their comprehension. Every mock, every act of cruelty, every attempt to suppress her had fed this moment, and now she stood unseen but omnipotent, the orchestrator of their reckoning. The hall fell silent, save for the soft metallic whispers of the chains, as if they themselves were exhaling in satisfaction. The stepmother's eyes darted around, seeking escape, guidance or intervention, but found none. The power that had been dismissed, the girl they had underestimated, now commanded reality itself. Her mastery of the chains, her patience, and her cunning had transformed suffering into authority. The once proud figure of cruelty now trembled, humbled and exposed. As the night deepened, the girl lingered in the shadows, observing the culmination of her long, silent preparation. The chains had done their work and justice had been served. The stepmother, who had thrived on mocking, controlling and breaking her, was now the prisoner of her own arrogance. The transformation was complete. The chains that had symbolized oppression were now the instruments of liberation and reckoning. The moment was surreal, yet charged with a weight that no villager could ignore. The hall, once alive with laughter, whispers and casual cruelty, fell into a tense, suffocating silence. The stepmother, bound by the very chains she had used to humiliate another, struggled in vain. Every thrash, every attempt to free herself, only tightened the iron around her, turning her previous instruments of power into unmistakable symbols of retribution. The villagers froze, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror, disbelief and dawning understanding. The laughter that had once echoed through their gatherings had vanished completely, replaced by the oppressive realization that power had shifted, and that it could strike at any moment. The girl, hidden from their sight but fully present in command, watched with calm precision. Years of suffering, ridicule and careful observation had culminated in this moment, and her patience had been rewarded. The chains responded to her will as extensions of her own intent, dragging the stepmother forward, controlling every movement and dictating every action. There was no malice in the girl's eyes, only a deliberate authority born from endurance and wisdom. The villagers could feel it even without seeing her, the invisible weight of someone who had once been weak, dismissed and scorned, now standing in silent mastery over their fates. As the chains tightened, the stepmother's earlier arrogance dissolved. Her voice, once loud and commanding, cracked and fell into whispers of fear. She stumbled, her balance compromised by the iron that obeyed the girl's subtle commands. Each movement seemed orchestrated by an unseen hand, the chains guiding her like a puppet whose strings had been turned against her. The villagers watched, frozen in a mix of fascination and horror, understanding that the girl's power was no longer latent. She had transformed her suffering into mastery, and her presence, though unseen, was absolute. The hall was alive with tension, the air thick with an almost tangible energy. The villagers, those who had once laughed at the girl's misfortune, now sensed a deep, pervasive force moving among them. Their eyes darted, their mouths opened in silent horror, and their hearts thumped against their chests. Even the children, who had once imitated her suffering as a source of amusement, shrank back, sensing that they were witnessing something far beyond ordinary punishment. The girl's patience, her careful cultivation of power, and her understanding of the chain's potential had created a spectacle none would forget. The stepmother's struggle grew more frantic, her movements desperate yet entirely futile. The chains, obedient to the girl's intent, adjusted with subtle grace, ensuring that each twist and pull reinforced her authority. The stepmother's previous cruelty, the relentless mocking and humiliation she had inflicted on the girl, now echoed back in full measure, mirrored in her helplessness. Every eye in the hall bore witness to the reversal of fortune, and the villagers' collective understanding of justice deepened. Fear had replaced arrogance, and silence had replaced mockery. The girl's presence, though invisible, permeated every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to bend subtly toward her will, the air itself vibrating with the energy she had cultivated through years of pain and perseverance. Each motion of the chains reflected her intent, the precise calibration of restraint and demonstration of power that she had honed in secret. The stepmother's cries of alarm were now tempered with an unmistakable realization. The one she had sought to crush had returned stronger, smarter, and completely in control. The villagers began to understand the lesson being etched before them. Power derived from cruelty could be temporary. Power earned through endurance, resilience, and quiet cultivation of strength was permanent and unstoppable. Their fear grew as the chains moved the stepmother forward, ever closer to a symbolic center of reckoning within the hall. She had once been the embodiment of authority, the figure everyone deferred to, the orchestrator of humiliation. Now she was its victim, and the villagers recognized with mounting dread that the girl's authority was not only personal but also moral and unassailable. Some villagers whispered to each other, their voices trembling. "Is it real?" one murmured. "Has she truly become?" But even the bravest could not finish the thought. The room's energy suggested that this was no ordinary retribution. The chains that had symbolized oppression were now instruments of justice, bending and shifting to reflect the girl's mastery. Every groan of iron, every flicker of movement, resonated like a message. Cruelty will always carry consequences, and those who wield it without wisdom will find themselves ensnared. The stepmother's own realization crystallized as she struggled against the chains. She had mocked, belittled, and sought to dominate, believing her authority unassailable. Yet here she was, stripped of control, dragged helplessly before those she had once commanded. Her face, twisted with panic, reflected the magnitude of her failure. And still, the girl remained unseen, a silent force whose mastery had reshaped the very dynamics of the hall. Every movement of the chains, every tightening and adjusting, spoke of careful planning, precision, and the culmination of long-suffering resolve. By the time the stepmother had been fully restrained, the hall was saturated with awe and terror. No laughter remained, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The villagers recognized that the girl, once scorned and humiliated, had become a presence they could neither challenge nor ignore. The chains, once symbols of oppression, had been transformed into extensions of her will, tangible proof that power rooted in patience, strategy, and resilience could overturn even the deepest injustices. In the end, the stepmother stood immobilized, the chains encasing her in cold, unyielding metal. Her previous arrogance had dissolved into fear, her mockery had returned to haunt her, and the villagers understood that they were witnessing not only her fall but also the rise of someone far greater than any of them had anticipated. The girl's silent strength had orchestrated this moment, turning instruments of cruelty into tools of reckoning, and leaving a lesson burned into the consciousness of every observer. The hall, once alive with mockery and the echoing laughter of the stepmother and the villagers, had become a place of tense silence. The girl, though unseen by most, held absolute command over the chains that had once bound her. Every link of iron responded to her thought, moving with a precision that was almost supernatural. The stepmother, still ensnared, could feel the weight of her own cruelty mirrored back upon her. Each tug and tightening of the chains reflected the girl's mastery, a silent, undeniable authority that left no room for doubt. The villagers, who had gathered to witness what they believed would be another scene of humiliation, were struck dumb. Their eyes darted from the struggling stepmother to the shifting chains, their minds unable to comprehend the power that had emerged from someone they once considered weak and powerless. Whispers spread like wildfire, but no one dared speak too loudly, fearing the invisible force that had taken command of the iron. The girl's control was absolute, her movements deliberate, her intent clear. Justice and balance had returned to the hall in a form they could not challenge. The stepmother, formerly a figure of fear and dominance, now trembled in the grip of the very chains she had once wielded as instruments of control. Every effort to free herself was futile. The iron followed the girl's unspoken commands with precision, tightening or loosening only at her discretion. Her arrogance had been her undoing, and the villagers watched, their faces pale with awe and terror, as the girl demonstrated that cruelty and power wielded without wisdom could easily be turned against its source. The air in the hall seemed to pulse with the girl's presence, even though she remained mostly unseen. The chains clinked and shifted as though alive, wrapping and unwrapping with a rhythm that mirrored her intent. It was a demonstration not of malice but of absolute control. Each link became an extension of her will, a tangible proof that she could transform the tools of oppression into instruments of mastery. The villagers felt the weight of her authority pressing upon them, a presence that demanded recognition and respect. Some of the elders attempted to speak, to intervene, but their voices faltered and died in their throats. The girl's power was not merely physical, it was the culmination of years of endurance, observation, and the sharpening of both mind and spirit. Her silent patience, her careful cultivation of inner strength, had produced a force that no one could defy. Every movement of the chains, every response to the stepmother's struggles, demonstrated that she was now the ultimate arbiter of authority in the hall. The stepmother's cries of alarm and panic echoed against the walls, but they carried no weight against the girl's control. Each cry seemed only to reinforce the lesson: cruelty, mockery, and abuse of power have consequences, and those who wield such forces without understanding will eventually be undone by them. The villagers, witnessing the scene unfold, felt a mixture of fear, awe, and a grudging respect for the girl who had transformed her suffering into mastery. Even the children who had once played at mimicking her misery were silent. They watched as the chains moved in impossible ways, bending and obeying a force they could not see but could undeniably feel. The girl's mastery was not violent in its intent. It was precise, calculated, and purposeful. She demonstrated that control could be exercised with intention rather than brute force, that patience and intelligence could transform helplessness into unassailable authority. The stepmother, recognizing that her former power was gone, began to sob quietly, her humiliation complete. The chains held her firmly, an unbreakable testament to the shift in power. The villagers began to bow their heads, some trembling, others unable to tear their eyes away from the demonstration of the girl's newfound command. Respect, fear, and awe had replaced laughter and mockery. The hall itself seemed to acknowledge that the girl's authority was now supreme. Every motion of the chains reinforced the girl's presence. They coiled, extended, and tightened at her command, moving with a fluidity that defied expectation. The stepmother's struggles were futile, the villagers' disbelief palpable, and the girl's silent, focused gaze was the only signal required to maintain order. In that moment she embodied the lessons of endurance, strategy, and inner strength, demonstrating that mastery is born not from brute force, but from resilience, intelligence, and the careful cultivation of power. By the time the demonstration concluded, the hall had been transformed. The stepmother remained bound, humbled beyond measure, and the villagers had been permanently altered in their understanding of authority and consequence. The girl, once mocked and chained, now stood as the ultimate figure of mastery, her presence unchallengeable, her power undeniable. She had turned instruments of oppression into extensions of her will, proving that no force, physical or social, could hold her when she had claimed her strength and authority. The villagers slowly began to recognize the full magnitude of what had occurred. This was not mere revenge. It was the affirmation of resilience, intelligence, and the rightful assertion of power. The girl's mastery of the chains had become a living lesson. Those who seek to oppress without wisdom will inevitably be undone, and those who endure with patience, strategy, and courage will rise to command respect and authority. By the end, silence reigned in the hall, broken only by the soft, deliberate movements of the chains that still obeyed her. The girl's presence, though largely invisible, was undeniable. The stepmother's authority had been obliterated, replaced by the awe-inspiring control of someone who had once been powerless. The village had witnessed a transformation that would be remembered for generations, a testament to the fact that mastery is forged in the fires of endurance, resilience, and quiet, unyielding determination. The girl, standing at the center of this shift, had proven something that could never be forgotten. No chain could hold her when she had mastered herself, and no force could stand against the resolve of one who had transformed suffering into unparalleled strength. The villagers bowed their heads, a mixture of fear, reverence, and understanding reflecting in every eye. They had learned a lesson written in iron, patience, and silent power, one that would echo through the village for generations to come.